We are.
I'm not sure he's the one that got hurt, but and one of the deer riders, he wrote a famous book. Yeah, he's the premier. Yeah, he formulated it. But I'm not sure. You never know. I'll look it up too. I'm gonna find out. Now you have me curious. Yeah.
بالحالة القصوى
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the third day of the International Conference on Palestine, and final day for that matter. Thank you very much for being with us today. Today we're going to have 3 sessions, and I think they will be as good as the previous ones. The first session today is titled Exploring Liberation Theology in the Palestinian Struggle. And it's indeed my honor to have 3 distinguished scholars, each in their own field, that will present different perspectives on Jewish, Christian, and Islamic liberation theology, and they will be introduced by our moderator, Mr. Fadi Za'atari. Fadi is a senior research associate at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs here, and a lecturer in the Political Science Department at Istanbul Salahuddin Zaim University. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from Al-Quds University, and he holds master's degree in international studies from Birzeit University and a master's degree in political theory from the University of Frankfurt, Germany. He's fluent in Arabic, German, English, and Turkish, and is currently pursuing his PhD at Ibn Khaldun University. Please welcome Fadi Za'atari.
Good morning. First of all, thanks to Dr. Sami Dorian. I remember last year when we started to plan for this conference, when I saw the name and the session, I said this is like something which is maybe not possible to do. Now we have this conference, so thankful Dr. Sami not only for putting the structure for this program, but also for letting us see that this is possible if we have a good plan and vision and work hard. Also, I would like to thank our partner, Ummat Waqfi and Qudus Platform. We spend a lot of time contacting with them, and for me personally, I was seeing how they are committed to the Palestinian case, and we are talking about liberation theology, which is being committed to oppressed people. I see how Ummat Waqfi and Qudus Platform, they are committed to the Palestinian case, standing with the oppressed people against the Israeli occupation. So thankful all of you also for coming. Our volunteer, or also the one who behind all of this scene, Yunus Agdenis. He is behind all of the work in CIGA. Always I contact with the speaker, but behind me always Yunus Agdenis. So today we have the 3 distinguished scholars. We have Professor Dr. Mark Ellis. We have Professor Dr. Ulrich Docho. We have Professor Farid Ishaq. This is 3 different perspectives. a Jewish perspective, a Christian perspective, and Islamic perspective to these three topics. It's amazing how we have one from America, one from Europe, one from South Africa. This is really interesting to have this discussion. I will shortly introduce the speakers, but you can read about them. For example, I just want to mention a few things about the speaker, Professor Dr. Mark Ellis. He is teaching and lecturing on Jewish identity, Holocaust, Palestine, Israel, and related issues since 4 decades. He wrote many books. One of the most important book in this regard, he wrote many, okay, but one of them is the Jewish Theology of Liberation, which is there is now third edition, and he will be talking about exploring liberation theology in Palestinian struggle, a Jewish perspective. Our next speaker is Professor Dr. Ulrich Docho, who is a professor of systematic theology in Heidelberg University, or Heidelberg Universität, which is one of the most beautiful cities in Germany. He wrote many books, many articles in different issues. Our session, one of the most important, transcending greedy money, interreligious solidarity for justice relations. Our next speaker, Professor Dr. Farid Ishaq, he came many times here because we like him. He always in our conferences. He is a scholar from South Africa. He is also activist. He wrote many books, and one of the most important is Quran Liberation and Pluralism. He is also a professor at the University of Johannesburg. He will be talking about exploring Islamic theology, Islamic liberation theology in the context of the Palestinian struggle for justice. Now the floor for Professor Mark Ellis.
Thou shalt not murder those who resist your oppression. These are my no Passover reflections on a Jewish theology of liberation. 2 years ago in Jerusalem, I celebrated the 30th anniversary of my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. I use the word celebration since my book is still relevant after all these years. Yet the relevance of my book also occasioned a mourning. Recent decades have seen a regression in Israel-Palestine rather than progress. And that's an understatement. These decades have been decisive. The permanent occupation of Palestine, the end of ethical Jewish history. When I launched my Jewish theology of liberation in Jerusalem, I was unknown in Israel and elsewhere. Yet the audience for my book launch was overflowing. The atmosphere was tense. Something was in the air. In Jerusalem, I called for a real two-state solution, with East Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. I called for the Prime Minister of Israel to confess to the Palestinian people the following: what we as Jews have done to you, the Palestinian people, is wrong. What we as Jews are doing to you, the Palestinian people, is wrong. Let us take the road of justice and equality into the future. I called for Israel, with the help of Jews around the world, to pay reparations to the Palestinian people. My public words were controversial. Months later, the Palestinian uprising began. A second edition of my book issued with a new epilogue titled The Palestinian Uprising and the Future of the Jewish People. Meanwhile, I was writing my next book. Its three-part title remains relevant today: Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People. They flowed together. With the Great March of Return and the recent Israeli elections, the thoughts contained in my book remain ingrained in Jewish history, but with a new twist. At the end of ethical Jewish history, What is the future for Jews and Palestinians? My Jewish theology of liberation begins with the Exodus narrative. In the biblical account, Jewish nationality, culture, and religiosity are forged in an act of liberation enacted by a liberating God. But for me, the Exodus points to a more important fact about Jewish history, that the prophetic, which reappears in the land, is our Jewish indigenous. A Jewish theology of liberation is clear on this point. There is only one reason to be Jewish: to draw near, to embrace, and to embody the prophetic. The critique of unjust power, especially within our own community, is the litmus test for the affirmation of God. Put simply, in Jewish life, no justice, no God. In the creation of the State of Israel, that equation was already under assault. I shifted to the contemporary formative event of Jewish history, the Holocaust. Where was God in the prophetic at Auschwitz? The State of Israel is a response to the twists and turns of European Christian history, culminating in the Holocaust. Yet in Israel's birth, a terrible evil was committed: the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. In Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, I affirm Jewish empowerment after the Holocaust. I question the cost of Israel's empowerment. I point to an ethical path to redress the wrong done in the creation of Israel. The first Palestinian uprising was the occasion for a reckoning and for a forward movement. In the decades since, Israel, with the assistance of the Jewish establishment in America, and surprisingly with the help of progressive Jews as well, foreclosed that possibility. Over the years, both groups ensured there would be no way forward. A Jewish theology of liberation also questioned what was occurring in the Jewish community in the United States. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Jewish community was among the most liberal communities in America on civil rights and women's rights, on economic, political, and international affairs. As the 1980s arrived, Jewish liberalism tacked right. Neoconservatism became the hallmark of Jewish thought and commitment. Part of my Jewish theology of liberation asks the question: is this neoconservative drift occasioned by the increasing centrality of the Holocaust in Israel to Jewish identity? These understandings of Israel and the world came within a consciousness that endures. Though highly political in its outward manifestations, it takes on an ultimate concern, a theological one. In a Jewish theology of liberation, I identify this consciousness as Holocaust theology. Holocaust theology begins in the 1960s and solidifies after the 1967 war. In the weeks before the war, large parts of the Jewish world felt that the very existence of Israel was on the line. The fear that if Israel was defeated, Jews in Israel would be annihilated. The second Holocaust would occur. Israel's swift victory in the war seemed more than a military victory to many Jews. Elie Wiesel experienced the Holocaust and feared another one. He rejoiced. Victory in the 1967 war seemed a miracle in the making, especially after many Jews felt that the world, indeed God, had abandoned Jews during the Holocaust. Could Israel's victory in the 1967 war be a redemptive response to the Holocaust? Emil Fackenheim posited a new commandment in relation to the 1967 war, which he believed issued from the commanding voice of Auschwitz rather than the commanding voice of Sinai. Thou shalt not grant Hitler a posthumous victory. So Holocaust theology became the introduction to my Jewish theology of liberation for political and religious reasons. It represented a momentous shift, identity shift, within the Jewish people. Holocaust theology speaks to a people brutally assaulted, humiliated, maimed, and murdered in Europe during the Nazi years. It speaks to the survival of an ancient people and tradition. Holocaust theology also carried warnings about the misuse of the power Jews needed and had acquired, though mostly in the abstract and under a maximum definition of self-defense. Holocaust theology did not address what Jews had initially done to Palestinians in the creation of Israel and continue to do to Palestinian people under occupation. In fact, Holocaust theology mostly rendered the Israeli occupation of Palestine and Palestinians themselves invisible. Holocaust theologians could not understand the reasons for Palestinians' opposition to Jewish power, except to declare that Palestinians held an animus toward Jews in Jewish history. Jews who argue with Israel's empowerment or parts thereof are painted with a similar brush. In Holocaust theology, when visible, Palestinians and their supporters are seen as anti-Semites. Jews who argue with Israel's use of power against Palestinians are defined as self-hating Jews. The interfaith ecumenical deal that emerged from the dialogue between Christians and Jews after the Holocaust is important in the early days of a Jewish theology of liberation. After the Holocaust, Jews told Christians to clean up their anti-Jewish theology. Many Christians wanted to do just that. Part of the dialogue insisted by Jews was that Christians accept Jewish self-definition that includes Israel as central to Jewish life. Jews insist that Christians accept the centrality of Israel to Jews as the main vehicle of repentance for their sin of anti-Semitism. To further this understanding and imbue it with theological significance, Christians developed a Christian Holocaust theology. In Christian Holocaust theology, Christians and the Christian covenant are dependent on their Jewish forerunners and Jewish empowerment, especially in Israel. Jewish Holocaust theology sees Jews as innocent in suffering and empowerment, including in the creation and maintenance of the state of Israel. Any criticism of Israel vis-a-vis Israel's treatment of Palestinians is deemed a return to anti-Semitism. Over the years, the Jewish-Christian dialogue morphed into the interfaith ecumenical deal. Christian repentance for the sins of anti-Semitism is assured in that deal by Christian silence on the plight of Palestinians. Now, Christian Holocaust theology in the interfaith ecumenical deal has a deep and abiding political impact in Europe, the site of the Holocaust, and in the United States, where an increasingly empowered Jewish community demands Israel be most favorably set apart in American foreign policy. Jewish and Christian Holocaust theology is the bedrock of the interfaith ecumenical deal. Combined with the rise of evangelical Christianity in America and in different parts of the world over the last decades, the concerted effort to suppress the indigenous Jewish prophetic becomes obvious. Jewish Holocaust theology is explicit on this point. Its logic is this: the Jewish prophetic turned inward threatens the empowerment of Jews, especially in Israel. Taken to its final demand for justice for the aggrieved, in this case Palestinian freedom, the Jewish prophetic threatens the very existence of Israel. In so doing, the Jewish prophetic, intentionally or not, may bring about a second Holocaust. That's the definition, the logic of Holocaust theology in relation to the prophetic. A Jewish theology of liberation is part of the revival of the Jewish prophetic, precisely where Holocaust theology feared most: Israel's unjust power wielded against the Palestinian people. Israel's invasion of Lebanon and the crushing of the Palestinian uprising in the 1980s marks the beginning of this fracture in Jewish identity consciousness. Yet it was during and after the second uprising in 2000 and beyond that the final prophetic break occurred. The initial division between what I call Constantinian Judaism, or Empire Judaism, and progressive Jews occurred within the second Palestinian uprising. Progressive Jews had criticized the Jewish establishment with regard to Palestinians, yet the criticism was often paternalistic toward Palestinians and disparaging of Jews who saw the crisis in Israel-Palestine more critically. The second Palestinian uprising confirmed that progressive Jews essentially functioned as the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. A third group of Jews, Jews of conscience, emerged. They realized that the Israeli occupation of Palestine was now permanently embedded in Israeli and Jewish life. Jews of conscience understand that the Constantinian progressive Jewish axis is complicit in an injustice that will continue. Only by refusing this axis can Jews and Palestinians be saved from a future characterized by a permanent occupation and, by definition, the end of ethical Jewish history. The continuing relevance of a Jewish theology is clear. Since 1987, a Jewish theology of liberation has narrated the failure of Israel and the Jewish establishments in America and elsewhere. A Jewish theology of liberation has also narrated the explosion of the Jewish prophetic movements over the last decades. Attempts to expand a Jewish theology of liberation are ongoing. These include the use of international law, critical historical analysis, BDS, and the questions about the coloniality of Israel and Jewish life. All are important, but they only make sense in a broader framework that a Jewish theology of liberation provides. The central question remains to us, the Jewish people. Has Jewish empowerment in Israel and elsewhere empowered Jews only, or has the abuse of that empowerment enslaved us? Has our empowerment healed us of the ravages of the Holocaust, or has it accentuated it through the oppression of another people? Passover has come to an end, but this year, as a Jewish theology of liberation enters its fourth decade, I suggested that Passover be literally passed over. With the maiming and murdering of Gazans participating in the Great March of Return, I propose that all attempts at politically and religiously reforming Jewish life be suspended. Hence my hashtag #NoPassover signage in my writing running up to Passover this year. Days before Passover, I came across a story about 3 young Gazans who were trying to cross back across the border into what now is Israel. They were shot by Israeli soldiers, then taken back with them into custody. 10 days later, the lifeless body of a 16-year-old boy from Rafah was returned. I wrote this in my diary. Israeli soldiers carried the wounded Gazan away. His crime? Trying to return home. So they shot him and took him in. Now he's returned to his other home, dead. I ask, when is silence better than empty words of outrage and deliverance? At least change the subject, out of respect for the dead and the living, who tomorrow might be murdered. Hashtag #NoPassover. If I were to write a Jewish theology of liberation today, where would I begin? Not with the Exodus, since Jewish liberation cannot be a one-sided affair, and not with the Holocaust, since the Holocaust today functions as a blunt instrument against the aspirations of the Palestinian people and against Jews of conscience who embrace the prophetic. Israel has failed to bring the redemption from the Holocaust it initially promised. Jews in Israel and beyond are enslaved to an empowerment characterized by ethnic cleansing, occupation, and theft of land. Hannah Arendt predicted this in the 1940s. The formation of Israel has led to the militarization of Jewish life within and outside the state of Israel. A Jewish theology of liberation might today begin with an addition to Emil Fackenheim's 614th commandment, the issuing of another commandment. The 614th commandment represents the resolve for Jewish continuity after the Holocaust, crystallized in an empowered Israel. The 615th commandment places the need for Jewish empowerment in a second after the Holocaust and after Israel, meaning after what Israel has done and is doing to the Palestinian people. The 615th commandment, thou shalt not murder those who resist your oppression.
Thank you very much for this enlightening presentation, very interesting. We will move now to our next speaker. The title of the presentation will be A Christian Perspective on Interreligious Solidarity for Justice. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Besides thanking Sami Al-Arian and his wonderful team, I want to express my joy to be in the midst between my two colleagues and friends who got to know each other in Peace for Life, which Farid Esak will address later. Religion has power over people, and so the powers that be try to co-opt it. This is why, with the South African Kairos document of 1985, we distinguish between state or capital theology supporting unjust power, church theology calling for reconciliation without justice, and prophetic or liberation theology resisting unjust power and working for transformation. In the case of Palestine, Israel, state and church theologies prevail in the coalition of Israel, the United States, and Europe, particularly Germany, where I come from. So let us see how these types of theology operate in reality. One, state or capital theology and church theology in relation to Palestine, Israel, in the context of the imperial capitalist system. Christian state or capital theology is rooted in post-Constantinian and later particularly European modernity. How have economic, political, and ideological power interacted, leading to the present situation, which is the climax of what is generally called Western civilization? A critical analysis of modernity as civilization shows that it is driven structurally, culturally, and psychologically by money, or more precisely capital accumulation linked to political and ideological power. This can be demonstrated by analyzing its legitimation narratives as developed by Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith. This economic dimension is connected to other factors, foremost the reductionist rationality of means-end calculation, which in turn becomes irrational and totalitarian. It leaves out the reproductive rationality that puts life and the sustenance of life at the center of critical thinking. But what is most important to understand is that in the tradition of the Hellenistic Roman empires, Europe and later the global West always had a coalition between capital and territorial, military and imperial powers. There were the political servants of capital competing among themselves to become its first servant, the hegemon. So this you can see from 1492 onward, when Genoa, the Italian city-state, with power through capital, made an alliance with the territorial military power of Spain, which opened up long cycles of capital accumulation regimes. The hegemony went from Spain to the Netherlands, to Britain, to the USA in the 20th century up to now, although the power of it is declining, as you know. Inherent in those alliances between capital and territorial powers has been the drive to link capital expansion with imperial expansion, always including ideological and cultural expansion. Beyond this basic economic, scientific, technical, and imperial drive for accumulation, we have the symbolic self-understanding of Europe and the Western civilization as superior to all others, which leads to racism and arrogance. So this is the legacy of Hellenistic and Roman imperial thinking regarding everybody else as barbarians. It is in this context of imperial capitalism and racist arrogance that the State of Israel came into being, which has been well researched, and we heard yesterday in various forms, particularly by Ilan Pape. In short, the Western colonial powers have enabled the settler colonialism of Israel up to this day. Zionist Israel is not a singular phenomenon of moral aberration, but stands in the tradition of the conquests of the Americas, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, which was developed by Ilan Pape. It follows the deepest logic of modernity. Christian state theology, with two important figures of this very city, Istanbul, first became mainstream in the 4th century, the Common Era. Emperor Constantine started to tolerate Christianity, and later Theodosius, who built the big fortifications here, made it state religion. After this time, all kinds of formation of state theology, or you call it also Constantinian theology, developed over the century. Up to these days, you remember George W. Bush calling the war illegal war against Iran a crusade, or Western politicians claiming Christian or Western values their neo-colonial policies. There are also religious formations mirroring capital power, like the prosperity gospel. In relation to Palestine, Israel, the most extreme form of state theology is Christian Zionism, which already Ilan Pape exposed yesterday. Christian Zionists are especially numerous in the United States and are strong supporters of President Trump. In Europe, there are fewer Christian Zionists. Here, particularly in Germany, you have rather what the South African Kairos document calls church theology. It is characterized by asking for reconciliation without justice. Let me share with you the particular situation in Germany. After the Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews, there was an intensive rethinking in theology and in the churches to deal with the root causes of this crime. The anti-Judaism or the post-Constantinian Christianity in its various phases was analyzed, and a new reading of the Bible started. This rediscovered the fact that Jesus as a Jew and the early Christian communities were deeply rooted in the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible that Mark Ellis explained. At the same time, a new Jewish-Christian dialogue started, as you already mentioned. All this was necessary and fruitful. But along the way, as you have exposed not only now, but also in a book that we published together called Interreligious Solidarity for Justice in Palestine, Israel, we have this situation that the dialogue was increasingly formed into a deal. The deal was Germany is silent about Israel's injustice against the Palestinians and is rewarded by being welcomed again in the Western imperial system. Israel's empowerment is supported without any condition and is allowed to stay in the role of the victim. So innocent Israel and innocent Germany legitimate each other. The price is paid by the Palestinians. This is why the German mainline churches are so silent about Palestine. Second, prophetic liberation theology and interreligious solidarity for justice. The single most important event for stimulating liberation theology in relation to Palestine and the Christian community is the publication of the Kairos Palestine document in December 2009. The title is A Moment of Truth, a word of faith and hope and love from the heart of the Palestinian suffering. This basic faith is expressed in interreligious language. Quote, we believe in God, one God, creator of the universe and of humanity. We believe that this dignity is one and the same in each and all of us. The concrete problem is formulated in the following way, quote, the West sought to make amends for what Jews had endured in the countries of Europe, but it made amends on our account and in our land. They tried to correct an injustice and the result was new injustice, end of quote. How to cope with this injustice? And they say, we declare that any use of the Bible to legitimize or support political options and positions that are based upon injustice imposed by one person on another or by one people on another transform religion into human ideology and strip the word of God of its holiness, its universality and truth. We also declare that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land is a sin against God and humanity because it deprives the Palestinians of their basic human rights bestowed by God. It distorts the image of God in the Israeli who has become an occupier, just as it distorts this image in the Palestinian living under occupation. And therefore we declare that any theology seemingly based on the Bible or on faith or on history that legitimizes the occupation is far from Christian teachings. Kairos Palestine envisages a future in which Palestinians, Jews, Christians, Muslims live together in a reconciled way. Historically, the Kairos Palestine document is absolutely right. Recent research has shown that all philosophies and religions of what is now called the actual age have several things in common: striving for justice, compassion, rejection of greed, and egocentric, calculating thinking. I have written the book about this that you quoted on transcending greedy money and interreligious solidarity for just relations. So dealing with the social effects, the mentality, the slavery, the expansionism of empire in that context. All cultures of Eurasia, you can observe the responses. In Israel, the prophets, as of Amos, call for justice. In Greece, you have Solon, the tragedies, later Socrates. In India, you have the Buddha. In China, Lao Tzu and Confucius. Later, Jesus calling for the decision between God and Mammon, and Muhammad take up the heritage of the prophets, revitalizing it in the context of the Roman Empire and the rich traders of Mecca. It is on this basis, this heritage, that we organized international and intercultural and interreligious project, producing this book on the radicalizing of Reformation, interreligious solidarity for justice in Palestine, Israel, which you can find on internet, radicalizing-reformation.com. Now, we have written this book in the context of 500 years of Reformation after 1500 2017. And we produced, and this is also published in this volume, the Wittenberg Declaration, saying we believe that the post-Constantinian anti-Judaism and Christianity, etc., used by Nazism as a basis for murdering millions was a crime against humanity, but we strongly believe that Christians and churches cannot atone for this crime by failing to take a stand against the unacceptable violations of human rights and international law by the State of Israel and its colonization of historic Palestine. One of the most important contributions in this volume is exactly what Mark said before. The article is called Repentant Enablers, German Christians, the Holocaust, and the Resurgence of German Power, Reflection from a Jewish Theology of Liberation. We have also another Jewish voice, Mark Braverman, who calls on the churches in the tradition of Bonhoeffer and the confessing church to stand up against the disenfranchisement of the Palestinians. And the World Communion of Reformed Churches, besides the WCC, who has various programs on this, they produced the declaration on Palestine, an urgent issue of faith for the World Communion. And it says, among others, the General Council affirms that with respect to the situation of injustice and suffering that exists in Palestine and the cry of the Palestinian Christian community, the integrity of Christian faith and praxis is at stake. Practical proposals follow, and one of that is that several churches in the United States and Scotland, and particularly also in South Africa, have joined, yes, I know, yeah, thank you, have joined BDS. And we in Germany have created, as response to the Kairos Palestine document, the Kairos Palestine Solidarity Network. From the German government, we request to link the support of Israel to the condition that this state abides by international law and human rights. One other author in our book, Sheer Hever, has shown that Israel can finance the occupation only as long as the United States, Europe, and particularly Germany also support Israel unconditionally. So we have created also a global Kairos network in various countries, and we also use public meetings like the German Kirchentag Church Days with 100,000 participants and more to organize a Palestine Day where also Farid will be on one of the panels. Now, there are now people in Germany and the Jewish communities and also public media, etc., who called us, for instance, Mark and myself, anti-Semites because of the publication of this book. Now, we tried to use that publicity to put those suppressed questions on the table, and we are rather successful with this. Because we challenge churches and also public media and others to just openly discuss these suppressed issues. And so there is a new kind of awareness building, and one of the key points was in the last in this year that there was a big struggle around giving the Peace Prize of the town of Göttingen to the Jewish Voice for Justice in the Middle East. And that for the first time really in public made it clear to the German public, which identified the Council of Jews in Germany with Israel and the Jews in general, that there are prophetic voices also in Germany, not just in the United States. And that is really a watershed in terms of our own experience, because the Germans are very caught in this kind of guilt feeling, and now these Jewish voices, prophetic Jewish voices, help the Germans to understand we are with the Jews, not against the Jews when we stand up for justice in Palestine, Israel. So interreligious solidarity for justice is even growing in Germany, a country whose anti-Semitism and crimes were among the key historical reasons for the emergence of Zionism and also one of its main supporters today. Such signs of interfaith solidarity give us hope, and one of the agents of this change here is liberation theology. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. You make me so curious to read the book. So I think I will put it soon on my reading list to have more information about this. Our next speaker, you know, liberation theology is about being active, it's about being on the ground, it's about supporting oppressed people. Our next speaker, Dr. Farid Ishaq, is someone who is supporting the Palestinian case, supporting BDS. He's a great person in the BDS in South Africa. Now his presentation will be exploring Islamic liberation theology in the context of Palestine.
Manipulating this, am I supposed to be? Are they? Are you? Sorry, he is. Okay. So we start with Google then.
Okay.
Google is a friendly colored. Well, at the moment, actually in Turkish, so I have difficulty analyzing the text for you. So I can just analyze the colors for you. Okay. All right. While we waiting for them to come and set me up, not come and set me up, come and set this up. Often speakers, they all start off deviating from their mandate. They start off by, well, they start off, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa ana abda bi-basmala bi-nafsi, okay, so, and then they start off deviating from protocol, and they thank Dr. Sami Al-Aryan. That's not a part of protocol, because the thanks belongs to the person who devotes the vote of thanks at the end. So they're all deviating from protocol. So I will also deviate from protocol. And Fadi, you're going to be in deep trouble with the entire staff of CIGA if you don't allow me to deviate from protocol. I'm warning you now. Right. There is a poem written by one of South Africa's very famous liberation poets, and he writes, "Beware what you ascribe to leaders. What you ascribe to leaders, you take from the people. Take from the leaders, give to the people. For people are colorful flags. For leaders are colorful flags. They waver and waver as the wind blows, as people work the bellows and make the whirlwinds thunder." So here we have the father of CIGA, and the father of many, many of the students and teachers and faculty at CIGA. And this father is celebrated by every speaker that comes up. But I happen to know this father before he came to CIGA in the United States. And I know for a fact that impressive and loving and charismatic and organized and as committed as Dr. Sami Al-Aryan is, he would have been nothing, absolutely nothing. He would have been a piece of rag flying there, hanging down there, if it weren't for his wife, if it weren't for his children, if it weren't for the many, many groups that supported him when he was incarcerated inside the United States and at CIGA. He would have been nothing if it weren't for a long list of people. And normally they say, they are far too long to mention, you all know who you are. That doesn't work. Amongst those people that makes this flag blow and causes all of our ships to run, to move in the sea, and to be here and to be fed and to be given our programs and to have people bringing water up to us and making sure that the toilets are clean. There are people behind the scenes. So, thank you very, very much to every single one of you. Ranging, not yet. Starting right from Yunus, who Fadi mentioned at the back, and then there is Linda, and there is Fadi himself, there is Uwais Khan, there is Amani Asenwar, there is Dilek, there is Riyad Al-Aryan, there is Husseina Hamda, there is Imad Atui, there is Abdullah Jarrah, there is Razia Wadud, there is Jamal Muhammad, there is Muhammad Taymir bin Tanvir, there is Yumna Sulaiman, be patient. These are the guys who are running after you all the time and making sure you get onto the buses on time. There is Taqwa Khair, there is Omar File at the back, there is Saima Wani, Saima Adesta, Saima standing, Isra Ibrahim Aguglu, Abdurrahman, Leila, Ayla, Ola, Sundus, Anwar Suwaile, Ali Shams Jawad Zadeh, Seher Sadiq, Minatullah, Sumaya, Fida, Mustafa Al-Hindi, Ijaz Al-Khaliq, there is Junaid, there is Rumaisa Sokan, Radwan, Atalia, the translators there, and of course the people who are in the multimedia. These are the people, friends, who make our flag blow. Sami Al-Aryan is able to shine because he has the back of all of these people, and they have his back, and they are facilitating his work. So, a large round of applause for all of them. People, just a quick word about liberation theology. It has been used by my two colleagues and friends, but let me very quickly say something about what it is. Liberation theology is basically the idea that we need to try to understand our theology. There's a process to it, and there are lenses to it. It's not so much about the outcome of our theology. I don't understand. Okay, fine, I understand that. Is one that is. It's not so much about the content of the theology. As for the process, liberation theology is developed in the midst of struggles, concrete struggles for liberation. So it's not a set of books that you buy and examine and study and then apply. You develop it in the midst of a struggle for justice. In the midst of that struggle for justice, you start off with the idea that God is the God of all creation, but that God has decided on what liberation theologians call the preferential option of the poor and the marginalized. And so you search in your texts for meanings that give meaning to the marginalized and enhances their struggles for liberation. And so it's not just, oh, the Quran speaks in a contextual way. So this wealthy millionaire oppressor Pharaoh says, I want to read the Quran in terms of my context. No, no, no. The Quran privileges the lives of certain people, certain classes, certain groups of people over others. Okay, so I want to talk about a particular document, a Muslim response to the Kairos document that Ulrich had spoken about. And this response was initiated by an organization called Peace for Life. I was the co-moderator of Peace for Life for about 10 years, and Junaid had also served in the leadership of PFL after that. And then there were others named. Gina was quite involved with PFL, and Ulrich Duchra, of course, served in PFL for a long time, and Mark Ellis had also served in PFL for a long time at Peace for Life. And the significant difference between Peace for Life and other interreligious organizations was that Peace for Life was committed to praxis, to action, for interreligious praxis for justice, rather than interreligious dialogue for peace. We weren't interested in dialogue. We weren't interested in dialogue at all. This endless round of where people sit and meet for tea and chat, and you tell me how good Islam is about women, and I will tell you how good Baha'ism is about women, and we go back and we all live happily ever after. We were interested in fighting together for justice. And in the middle of the struggle, if we get to chat about theology, ahlan bika, it's fine. If you want to talk to me about the crucifixion and the resurrection, and you talk about how the crucifixion means the suffering and the crucifixion of your people, and the resurrection, the hope that Christ represents to people after liberation, I'm happy to buy into it and to listen to it. But if you want to talk about the crucifixion and the resurrection as a kalami, theological concept and so on, okay, fine. I may come and attend one of your seminars one day, but I'm not interested in it at all. So in the West, there's this whole industry going on around interfaith dialogue. Peace for Life had nothing to do with that. It was a radical break from this kind of endless cups of tea that nothing comes from. And in Peace for Life, Muslims were viewed as the primary victims of the contemporary oppression, and in some ways the particular identification of Muslims as a community to be in solidarity with. Professor Zubrau spoke about the Kairos Palestine document. Now, in the Reformed tradition, there is a history of producing documents over years and so on. And these, in some ways, are both the confessional documents. What do we confess to? What do we believe? But they often contain an element of where have we messed up? And so the Kairos document has its own history. In 1982, the Confession of Belha, for example, also a Protestant document, spoke about the crimes of the Dutch Reformed Church against apartheid and the need for the Reformed Church was, it's in some ways the way Judaism functions officially in Israel at the moment, where it is the state at prayer. The state at prayer inside Israel, by the way. And then this was followed in 1985 by Kairos South Africa, a document that was signed by most of our church leaders condemning apartheid and laying out a Christian theological basis for the attack on apartheid. In 2009, we spoke about this. There was the Kairos Palestine that was drawn up after prayer, reflection, and exchange of opinions, and it was signed by most Palestinian Christian leaders, described as a word of faith, hope, and love from the heart of Palestinian suffering. Under the Israeli occupation, with a cry of hope in the absence of all hope, a cry full of prayer and faith in a God ever vigilant, in God's divine providence for all of God's inhabitants of this land, inspired by the mystery of God's love for all, the mystery of God's divine presence in the history of all peoples, and in a particular way, in the history of our country, we proclaim our word based on our Christian faith and our sense of Palestinian belonging, a word of faith, hope, and love. And so the Kairos Palestine's message was a heartfelt call from the Christian Palestinian brothers and sisters for the will to act in the face of their daily humiliation and dispossession. And this call resonated across the globe. In many other countries, including Germany, the United States, in Switzerland, even in Japan, people produced their own local responses to the Kairos document. Peace for Life, with its own deep commitment to intensifying the solidarity of the global religious community against apartheid, and its Muslim members felt the need to respond to Kairos Palestine from an Islamic perspective. We want to say to our Christian sisters and brothers in Palestine, we have heard your cries. You are not alone. We need each other now more than ever, and we undertake to walk this journey side by side towards freedom and justice in Palestine for all its inhabitants. Now, most of the text that follows actually comes from this Muslim response to the Kairos document. In responding to Kairos Palestine, we seek to express the Islamic imperative to identify with the oppressed and the marginalized, we do so in a manner that reflects our inadequacies as Muslims, rejects any and all attempts to co-opt our faith or the agenda of, for the agenda of the empire, and thirdly, offers a vision of Islam that is just and compassionate, along with a particular partiality for those whom the Quran describes as the marginalized in the earth, the mustad'afuna fil ard. Now, the Muslim response to Kairos is directed at three communities. And because of the fascist nature with which this conference is being run, I can only deal with three of them. Okay, I will only deal with three of them. The one is it's addressed to our own people, the Muslim Ummah, the Christians of Palestine, and the Jewish community. And then, of course, there's also the international community, but I will not go there. As for the message to the Muslim Ummah, now note how, when you declare something, you start off, it's like the Imam in the Jumu'ah, أوصيكم وإياي بتقوى الله. أو أحيانا يقول أوصيكم نفسي أولا وإياكم بتقوى الله.
Go back to English.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, right. Rabab, you need to understand.
I understand.
You need to understand. You have to kind of prove your gravitas. These things, you know, by... okay.
صلي على النبي.
Is Rabab out of order? Can I continue with my showing off with my Arabic? Is Rabab out of order? Okay, so the first is a confession. You know, often we are more than happy as Muslims to listen to the confessions of other people about what they did towards us. We're not so good in owning up to our own messes, okay? It's one of the things that we learn from the Reformed tradition. It is in our own tradition. The idea of istighfar, the idea of tawbah, all of this we have. But in contemporary theology, contemporary Muslim discourses, we don't have it. So, we stand in humility in front of Allah for our collective and individual failure to foreground the struggle of the Palestinians and for carrying on with life as normal in the face of daily injustices visited upon them. Our efforts have been inadequate, and the rulers and governments in many of our countries have offered half-hearted public condemnation of Zionism and the occupation on the one hand, while actively collaborating with the Israeli regime on the other to contain their own population's ability to act in solidarity with the Palestinians. The context for addressing the Ummah. We live in a time when many incessantly demand that as Muslims we proclaim our belief in peace and harmony before all else. We acknowledge our responsibility to work for peace. We, however, do not work for peace in response to the demands of the imperialists who insist that Muslims must play dead as these powers roll over our bodies and our lands in pursuit of oil and other natural resources. We struggle for peace in response to the call of the Almighty, Wallahu yad'u ila dar salam. This abode of peace bears no resemblance to the peace of the empire. Their peace is one of silence and acquiescence in the face of dispossession and occupation. Theirs is a peace that trades in death. The vision of liberation theology, the peace of the Quran is one of life, of justice and of dignity. We are mindful of the Quranic obligations to disturb the established order. So Muslims have a responsibility to be troublemakers. If the order is based on injustice and dispossession, the Quran places on humankind the task of doing justice within the context of their responsibility to the Creator on the one hand, and the order that runs through the cosmos on the other. The status quo in a particular social order, irrespective of how long it has survived or stable, it has become, does not enjoy an intrinsic legitimacy in Islam. Injustice is a deviation from the natural order, though it may stabilize over decades by establishing new facts on the ground and the persistent building of illegal settlements. It is regarded as a disturbance in the mizan, in the balance. In a situation of injustice, the Quran, by its own admission, must become an inspiration for a comprehensive insurrection against oppression, and all manifestations for justice is indivisible. And so the call upon Muslims is to deepen and to intensify their resistance to all forms of oppression and to strengthen their solidarity with the Palestinians. The message to the Christians. It starts off with a homage. The courage of Christians, their steadfastness in resisting the occupation, and we are humbled by the persistent refusal to succumb to the divide and rule games of the occupiers. Their religious commitment to freedom has been inspirational. In many cases, they have provided leadership in saying no to injustice, and they have continued to articulate the truth that underlines that this is not a battle between Jew and Muslim, but one between occupied and occupier. And at the same time, we have often been indifferent to Christian presence in that part of the world. A presence that predates the coming of Islam. We've not been adequately mindful of the absolute centrality of that sacred space in the Christian religious imagination. We acknowledge that we have frequently articulated a vision for a post-apartheid Israel that appears to be one where one form of religio-ideological domination, Zionism, will be supplanted by another one, an Islamic religio-ideological domination. And often in our resistance to the ideological domination of Zionism, we have come across as wanting to repeat the same, to become the same evil that we abhor, this time with us, the Muslims, being the sole victorious ideologues. And in doing so, we have been unfaithful to the pluralism of our faith and the Quranic vision of a single people, addressing all the prophets. The Quran declares, يا أيها الرسل كلوا من طيبات واعملوا الصالحات وإن هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة. And so, we support the vision of a call for a post-apartheid Palestinian for all its citizens, equal justice, liberty, respect for pluralism, and not a country dominated by a religious or a numerical majority. We will work towards challenging our co-religionist Palestinians to create a society where everyone, regardless of their religious or sectarian affiliation or absence of any, will be equal. A second-class citizenship for any Palestinians, we believe, will diminish the worth of all Palestinians and will be a betrayal of the sacrifices of those on the margins. Our call to Muslims is to ensure justice is not only about justice for Muslims or even people of the book, but for all. Atheists, Baha'is, Druze, women, those of lighter skin pigmentation, those of darker, and yes, those who identify as LGBTQI and others. Above all, privileging economically oppressed, who usually have the least means to buffer themselves from the effects of oppression. Fadi, just 2 minutes for my Jewish pundits. Okay. As a message for our Jewish brothers and sisters, we are ashamed of our co-religionists who routinely engage in the blanket rubbishing of you and your religious traditions. With regards to Jews, to all Jews on the whole, contemporary Muslims have little to be proud of. Much of our rhetoric is racist and anti-Semitic, and we have far too often failed to distinguish between the diverse tendencies that you comprise. And this is in conflict with the Quranic principle that no one shall bear the crimes committed by another. We are aware that on the whole, historically, Jews have fared much better when they lived in Muslim majority countries than when they lived in others. We're also aware that after the Nakba, in the Muslim world, after the Nakba, anti-Semitism has accelerated inside the Muslim world. We acknowledge that notwithstanding the contribution that many Jews have made to Muslim societies wherein they live, by contemporary standards of universal human rights, the way in which we have often at times restricted your rights in our society left much to be desired. Our religious and textual tradition similarly requires critical scrutiny, and we must find new ways to discover our interconnectedness as human beings. And then there is an acknowledgement of the few among you who have great personal cost stood up against injustice, and an acknowledgement of their role and the value of their solidarity. There is a scathing critique of a small minority who have arrived in that of a majority, a small minority from outside, and now constituting the majority, come from abroad, usurp the rights of those who have been living all the time, and a clear statement: it is impossible for us to regard you as anything but usurpers and colonizers. You have been pulled into this perpetual enlistment into the divine army, the appropriation of God and turning God into a little Jewish character. Allahu Akbar, God is greater than, the eternally greater than, is greater than you or your attempts to reduce him to a tribal chief. So we cannot reduce the eternally transcendent to a dishonest real estate agent who parcels out land to his favorites. Okay, I'm on my last frame. The tragedy of the unspeakable horrors visited upon the Jews in the Nazi Germany must not be allowed to be forgotten, nor the ongoing attempts to manipulate this tragedy for narrow, racist, and ideological ends that create new victims. An injury inflicted on others invariably comes back to haunt those doing the inflicting. It is not possible to tear at another's skin and not have your own humanity also diminish in the process. To defend the Palestinians against the daily humiliation by the Israeli settlers and colonists, it is to defend the best in what Jews have to offer the world. An injury to one is an injury to all. It is no longer possible, as Mark Ellis, the greatest of all Jewish prophets alive today, and whom we have the honor to have on the platform with us, as Mark Ellis has said, to raise the banner of the revolution for one people only. It's just no longer possible. You cannot build your security on the insecurity of others. In the freedom of and justice for the Palestinians are the seeds of your, meaning the Jews, your own freedom and security. And so we pledge ourselves to work against all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Semitism. And then there is that slogan that we had during the South African liberation struggle: freedom or death, victory is certain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. We gave you 7 minutes more, so I think you will not be able to answer any of the questions. Okay, so I have a three quick question for Dr. Mark Ellis. You mentioned no justice, no God. So, and Holocaust theology, seeing the Jewish people as innocent, but what about the Palestinian? Why the Holocaust theology doesn't see like the Palestinian as also innocent? For the next question, you mentioned the Israeli occupation is a sin for God. I would like to ask, how can we activate more the Christian, like make the Christian more active in supporting the Palestinian case, and especially standing against the Zionist movement? For Dr. Farid, I will ask you. You mentioned liberation theology in Islam is based on the Quran, the idea of istighfar, etc. Who would you think is the founder for liberation theology in Islam besides Farid Ishaq? Okay, now we will move to questions. First of all, I would give the floor to my student if you have any questions. Okay, from this side. Yes, please. Please introduce yourself and go directly to the question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for this presentation, Dr. Tiamat. My question is for Dr. Mark, and I'm yet actually to read one of your books. You're here. Yeah. Would you please elaborate more on what you mean by ethical Jewish history? Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Rabab, next.
Thank you, Rabbi Abdul Hadi, San Francisco State University. Thank you for this intervention. It gives you a lot of food for thought. I have two questions, one for Mark Ellis and one for Farid Ishaq. And I will begin with the Farid Ishaq question. I'm kind of like, in the treatment, well, one question is that how has this document been received by different members of the Muslim Ummah? And especially in Palestine, but not necessarily only in Palestine. And how has it been received by other members of the Jewish and the Christian perspective that you're calling on? How has it been faring? I also sense some kind of exceptionalizing of Jews in particular in kind of like the last part that you talked about. And I think this is something that a lot of the times we tend to do when we are talking about Palestine. When the question of advocating for justice in for Palestine, we do, and I do this as well, and I'm thinking about how can we actually engage more towards in the continuum, towards the question of justice, and less towards exceptionalizing. And for the question for Mark Ellis, I really am blown away because there's so much stuff here is. But I was wondering about the whole question of the narrative, and if we don't begin with the Holocaust, if the Holocaust is not the starting point, but we think about a different starting point, or also we think about the different groups of Jewishness, not the Jewish community, but think about, for instance, Jews who have never ever experienced the Holocaust, the Jews in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Jews of the Arab world, the Jews of Andalusia, and so on, who never experienced the Holocaust. So the Holocaust is actually not a defining moment for them. And many Israeli and Jewish Mizrahi and Sephardic scholars and activists actually speak about that, from Ella Shohat to Yehuda Shehnaf to several people I can cite in the. So how would this work if we are thinking about the Jewish, not the Jewish community, but Jewish communities and their relationships to Palestine, to questions of other faiths, to questions of the location, the positionalities in which they find themselves. And then secondly, even with the question of the Jews of Europe and the United States, and then where do we place, which is Orlik spoke about, the whole question of the role of the European and the US in closing the doors to and preventing Jews who are escaping from the Holocaust, first not saving, and second, not in getting involved in the saving. Yeah, I'm just give me 30 seconds, just to make sure that my ideas are not misunderstood. It's not only not saving, but also closing the doors for Jews who are escaping from the Holocaust to be able to settle in places in dignity. And thus Palestine becomes the only place, the only open place because of colonial domination for Jews who are the victims to call. And I'm not actually arguing that they're the ones who victimized Palestinians, because it was the earlier Zionists and so on. So how do we think about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baumgarten.
Three brief questions to all the speakers. My name is Helga Baumgarten from Goethe State University. The first question to Mark Ellis. How are you received by the group of Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States above all? And my brief question to Professor Tuchro. How did you manage to bring your colleague, Dr. Farid, to the German Kirchentag? And why is it not possible to bring someone like, for example, representatives of Palestinian liberation theology to Germany. Just a brief information for all. One of the last German church meetings in Germany, Palestine was actually excluded, and it was the Catholic Church which allowed us space to present our discussions with a lot of support from the public, but the official church is denying access to Palestinians and Palestinian liberation theology. And finally, my question to Dr. Farid is, how do you face the extreme challenge and the hegemony of the current Islamic interpretation coming from Saudi Arabia? Thank you.
So, Dr. Saleh عندك جواب؟ أبو حجلي.
Thank you. As I said yesterday, 37 years ago, I was imprisoned in Al-Far'a prison in the Jordan Valley, which was an old British military compound turned into a concentration camp and a torture place to extract confession from young Palestinian activists. We were whipped, we were tortured, but what hurt me most, to be honest with you, there was a German Jewish guard. When we used to come out from the cell, he used to stand and put his fingers on his nose and with a face with disgust as we passed out from room 17. I remember the room 17. And this brings me, when I grew up and I became more conscious, I used to say, and I had Jewish friends in the United States, I used to say, I want to save the Jews from Israel. Because Zionism actually has destroyed the fabric of Jewish presence in the Middle East. There were Jews, as you all know, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, all over the Middle East. Okay? And this, and this, brings me to a model I have two more points and then I'll end very fast. The character of Muhammad Assad, who was Leopold Weiss. Leopold Weiss was an Australian, Hungarian, Jewish journalist in the 20s who came to the Middle East and converted to Islam. And you can check his writings, The Road to Mecca and The Road to Mecca, Islam at the Crossroads, many stuff. And he died at 92 and he's buried in Cordoba, in Grenada. Very interesting move and very interesting liberation theology, Muhammad Assad, Leopold Weiss. And the last thing I would like to say, I would like to end with a call for an integration of liberation theologies between Islamic, Jewish, and Christian, based on the Quranic call, قل يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم. Come to a unified word between us to worship only one God.
Thank you.
And the last word I would add one commandment: thou shalt end and dismantle Israeli Zionist apartheid.
Okay, thanks. So the last two, please here.
Thank you for your talks. I have two questions. The first is, actually they're both for all of you, or whoever would like to answer them. All three of you talked about the question of truth and reconciliation and the absence of justice and truth and reconciliation processes. And I guess maybe the question is a bit more catered to Dr. Farid about South Africa specifically. In a recent delegation, many of the youngsters that we were speaking with said that the truth and reconciliation process replaced justice with the question of truth, that truth then became equivalent to reconciliation. And so I guess my question is, how do we think of interfaith work between different theological perspectives that really has a more in-tune analysis of power relations and places justice really at the center alongside questions of truth? The second question that I have, and I know that you didn't speak specifically to this, but I know for many organizers here, this is an important question for us about interfaith work that's taking place today, that's specifically in some ways I don't know, neutralizing Zionism because it's important interfaith work. Specifically, I'm thinking of refugee aid relief work, in which you have people coming from Christian, Muslim, and Jewish theological backgrounds who are doing refugee aid and relief work, but that there's very strong tenets of Zionism within it. And so how would you suggest activism, we can address an interfaith framework that attends to sort of these non-overt expressions of Zionism in our organizing?
Okay, last question. Is there any question on this side? Okay, please. And finally, to Ramzi Baruch.
My name is Jaime Bebe. I'm from New York. I'm actually a union organizer, not an academic. But my knowledge of liberation theology, especially from the Latin American perspective, where much of it originated, was that it was much more than just a theological, intellectual debate. It was also the importance of being grounded in the actual organizing. So my question is, how do you translate your understanding of liberation theology, and how does it reflect itself within the respective societies that you're addressing? Does it become organically linked in struggles, in organizing? If I'm clear about that.
Okay. The last with Ramzi, and then we will move to the answering the question.
Thank you very much. And maybe this issue been addressed earlier, since I arrived a little bit late. It's just a bit of criticism, or critique rather, of the lineup in the podium. The fact that there is no Palestinian speaking about liberation theology. I mean, we invented the thing. If you go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, even the Fatah movement started with liberation theology, rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood, all the way to Hamas, Islamic Jihad. I would have really loved to see what the Palestinian perspective on liberation theology would be, considering that we are the most engaged Muslims and Christians anywhere in the Middle East, very much involved in an everyday reality of liberation theology. I think that would have been interesting. Otherwise, we end up with another interfaith dialogues, which we try to avoid like the plague.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor, I would like to start with the professor, sorry. You have 3 minutes, please.
Yes, I will try to be fast. Rabab is not, Professor Blad is not here, but very quickly. It has been, I don't know, say as would have been expected, it has been pretty well received in the non-Muslim world. And this itself is an indicator of a lot of different kinds of problems. It's been translated into Chinese, into German, into Philippines, into Malayalam, into several different languages. It hasn't been translated into any of the predominantly Muslim-used languages. There has been conversations inside Palestine with formal Palestinian political formations and religious formations, and the general distinction was that our people aren't ready for it. In my own work on HIV and AIDS, in working with religious leaders, generally, when people say our people are not ready for it, that was code for the fact that we aren't ready for it. So that is basically my response to that. I think that Professor Abdulhadi does have a point about the exceptionalizing of Jews and the elevation of anti-Semitism. She didn't say this, but an extension of that. The elevation of anti-Semitism as a form of privilege. And that is a serious problem. And one is caught between resisting this on the one hand, and on the other hand, that in many parts of the world, Ramzi may have something to say this, although you have a chance to speak now, but you certainly have something to say about this. Although as a conversation starter, in many, many parts of the world, you're just not going to have anybody listening to you if you don't also establish or affirm your anti-Semitic kind of credentials. But the larger issue of the anti-Semitism discourse currently functioning and being weaponized as a part of white privilege, there is lots of space for us to actually develop that and expand on that. As for the quick question on Saudi hegemony, what do I deal with Saudi hegemony in interpretation? Well, I'm indifferent to it. I don't pay attention to it. I ignore it. I go and excavate other more traditional, long kinds of exegetical works, which I often find far more enlightening material than what comes out of contemporary Saudi Arabia. So I'm happily indifferent to it, you know, lakum dinukum waliya din. To you, your faith, and to me, mine. The question of interfaith work versus interfaith dialogue, it's a very, very crucial one. I think that interfaith dialogue, it is part of a butterfly game of escapism and digression from the real problems, and interfaith joint assistance in relief work and so on. I find that equally problematic. I think that what is required is of people of different religions to work with each other in first of all countering the root that's the arms industry. It is the power of the global north that people must find ways of working with each other from a faith perspective, bringing your faith inspirations to the table and sharing that with each other. But all else are ways of ducking and avoiding things. One important question, Jamie, that you raised was, and this is the last one that I'm going to respond to, it is the question of, at the heart of liberation theology is praxis. And the first moment of liberation theology is not the theological text or theological reflection. It is engagement and get your hands dirty. And from your hands being dirty, you reflect on where the dirt comes from, how do my hands get dirty, what does the text have to say about the fact that my body is bloodied at the moment. And then you see religious truth. But first, your hands get bloodied or your hands get dirty, and that is, so in the context of how I first developed or grew into this, it was the South African crucible against apartheid, and subsequently I got involved into other struggles, whether it was on the question of religion and HIV and AIDS, or environmental justice, and currently in BDS. For a few of us, that praxis has now shifted to our engagement and the theological reflection on that engagement in the liberation struggle. But it is also true that for many other people, people are writing about it without a context, and one of the tragedies is that a movement that you saw in the Philippines or in Latin America that gave, that was the bread and butter, so to say, of liberation, that has largely been absent, except for South Africa during the liberation struggle, and at the moment in Kerala and the south of India, where there are movements utilizing these texts as part of their struggles against, say, casteism, the Hindutva hegemony, and so on. But it's very, very inadequate.
Okay, next, you have 5 minutes.
Let me pick up on that, and then come to the other questions. As a matter of fact, Kairos Europe, to which I belong, does exactly this. So our approach is to concentrate on this global struggle in linking it to particular struggles, and always doing it in organizing social movements or building alliances between social movements, trade unions, and also then ecumenical movements in order to involve the sectors of society in this struggle and to break through hindrances to cope with these struggles. So it is exactly that kind of approach that we are also taking. And that also links to these other questions in terms of involving or starting from the Palestinian people. Helga, the point is you do not know the program. I mean, the Kairos Palestine Solidarity Network, which is a sub-organization of our Kairos Europe work, which is globally oriented but then concentrating on the Palestinian issue. We are really doing every step in in relation to our partners in Kairos Palestine. And at the occasion of the Kirchentag with the big masses of people, it is always that we have representatives of Kairos Palestine there. I also organized certain encounters with just only Palestinian liberation theologians, encountering these people who are doing the Christian-Jewish dialogue and trying to win them over to the struggle, etc., etc. So in this case particularly, in June, in the next Kirchentag, we have Rifat Kassis, who is the present coordinator of Kairos Palestine, opening the whole thing. Viola Raheb is in one of the panels, not in that one you are on, but on the panel which I am on. The sister of Mitri Raheb, who cannot come this time. Normally he is one of the key players in that. And also in global Kairos for Justice, yes, we are always starting from those initiatives of those proposals, those visions, from the Palestinian ground. So it is exactly the method we are using in both the Kairos Palestine Solidarity Network in Germany and also Global Kairos. I could go into more detail, but the time is short. I wanted to link that again to the question of the original question of Hadi. How to mobilize in that situation. That's, of course, a very complicated issue, as you may imagine, and I can't go into the details again. But I think one experience that we do is the following. In our situation, as I just mentioned briefly, the Israeli Hasbara propaganda machinery is very effective in all sectors of society, starting from the government, but also in the churches. So what we are, and so their strategy is to, simply crush those who stand up for Palestine, hinder or make it not possible. You can tell about your Hamburg experience, etc. So we have quasi-professional hinderers, I would say, in terms of bringing the Palestinian issue to the fore. Now, the interesting thing is, with now the attack against this book, we have the following strategy. They are trying to, first of all, the anti-Semitism responsible of the German government, national government, calls the publisher of this book in the first edition, telling him to withdraw that book from the catalog, which they did. But immediately another publisher comes and says, I do the second edition. Now, in a few weeks, more copies were sold from the second edition because they give us publicity with those attacks. So in that moment, we are turning around the spear, so to speak, and saying, please, let us discuss this openly and publicly. And what is happening, because they are failing now with that oppressing the debate about it. Now we are challenging them and said, please come out into the fore, come out into the public. And that will, one of the panels where Farid will be on in June, is exactly doing this with one of the most important, how should I say, liberal Zionists in Germany, who is very famous and everybody listens to him, etc. So Farid will challenge him. Yes? And the interesting thing is, now as we are challenging them to come to the open, then what is happening in those meetings and events, this is very important experience. People who feel under a collective pressure not to touch this issue, in the line of what Mark said in terms of the deal, yes, which is extremely effective. Yes, now they have to come, and what happens is they don't have argument. In the moment they have to stand up and be on a public platform, they can't answer. Yes, so just briefly, in that sense, I think we have a new stage now in that situation, that people say, oh, finally we can openly discuss these issues. And that's a very good experience.
Thank you very much. 5 minutes.
Well, I'm feeling actually very peaceful today, so I apologize. I'm not as fiery. I'm not sure why. Maybe I've been writing too much for too many years. I go where I'm invited. If people don't want to hear my point of view, they shouldn't invite me. It's really simple. I have spent my years very limited in my perspective. When I go to Jewish Theology of Liberation, I didn't know anything about any of this, and it had never been spoken in the contemporary scene. Naim Atik, who should be here, his book was brought home, his dissertation, by me to Maryknoll. That's where it was published. We brought Naim Atik over for a year. I worked with him behind the scenes. His book, Justice and Only Justice, came out within that context. The work of Naim Atik and myself were the first break in the interfaith ecumenical deal in the West, which is where I live, in the United States. So I speak from that perspective. I also think that it's very important to speak publicly in a way that can move, of course I have failed to. And one of the themes of this conference, we're at the end of ethical Jewish history, which may be important to some or not, but it's very important to me. And that can be seen in many different ways. And there's a lot of diversity in the Jewish world, which I've learned about over the years. I'm a simple Jew from North Miami Beach, Florida, and I've tried to do my best. But there are many voices, but I wonder about those voices, including Jewish Voice for Peace. They are working with many different groups, and they should. But will that add up to a public discussion of the question of Israel and Palestine in the United States, which is where I live, or in Europe? It's not a question of whether it should, whether it's right, but whether it can. Martin Buber talked about the failure of the prophetic, but the prophet stands in the blaze of public life. And we can describe what public life is. In Berkeley, it's something. In the broader context of the United States, it's another. And so there must be many voices. But I am saying that these distinctive voices on the coloniality of Israel are not going to make it in the United States. This is not an argument that's going to work. Now that said, I had another part of my talk, but I obeyed the time limit. And maybe tomorrow I'll... But my basic point is that a lot of the issues discussed here, which I'm very familiar with, and which I agree with, are not going to win this discussion. Now, there may be no discussion that will win, which is what I think, actually, that we're in a permanent occupation at the end of ethical Jewish history.
Thank you very much. So as we see, the great things about liberation theology is seeing a Christian, Jewish, and Muslim standing together, supporting the oppressed people. And here we have the case of Palestine. Thank you very much for the question for our distinguished speaker. Now we will go back to Dr. Saman. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the panel, for a great presentations. Thank you so much. And I think we have a lot to think about, and I think a lot to reflect on, and especially from the three different perspectives. And I think they are all converged together, presenting, I believe, one liberation theology, there was the question about why wasn't there Palestinian in liberation theology. I think about half of our speakers are Palestinian in this roughly, in this conference, and each one of their own way presented some sort of a liberation, or at least their view of how this is happening. Certainly in my presentation, I tried to present how we can liberate the land from occupation and colonization, how we can liberate the Palestinian from oppression, Judaism from Zionism, and the world at large, how it can be a more peaceful world. At any rate, I want to thank also Dr. Farid for giving my speech and and thanking all the unknown soldiers of this conference. Certainly they have worked, you can see a lot of them around, and we really thank them for all the hard work they put into this. And I want to acknowledge them now since they have been mentioned the name. So thank you very much, and we can give them a big round of applause. Okay, well, I would like to present a few mementos for our speakers. First, Dr. Mark Ellis.